Yeah, so there is this endless tension between and despair, what we've been calling in the conference so far, the tension between pessimism and optimism. And on the side of optimism, what I've discovered in poking around, doing a lot of reading, in a way it seems obvious, is that the optimists put their hope in the idea that technology will save us, that it'll be technology or some advance in science that will pull us through just in time, and that the genius of humanity is to stay that one step ahead of the Green Reaper. And I noted recently that the population of the planet Earth has peaked 7 billion. It's on a path to 9 or 10, and in that kind of circumstance, it seems obvious that we're talking about peak everything, not just peak oil, peak food, peak, and the question is, how are we going to cope? Is it all going to be seaweed out of the oceans, or is it possibly the Star Trek replicator? Does anybody remember that? Computer, make me an omelet. Computer, a steak medium rare, please. Well, it's not that far-fetched, and in order to pursue this line of thought, I've invited an old pal of the conference, Hod Lipson. Hod's from the famous Israeli School of Technology. He's now at Cornell. He heads up some fancy institute that got interested in 3D printers, and for the last number of years, he's been kind of making these kits and encouraging people to have their own 3D printers, and for the long time, what they made were circuit boards and funny objects that nobody could get much interested in, and then the day came and they began to experiment with food. So, Hod, will you take the story on from there?
It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you a little bit about some of the work we're doing in the area of 3D printing. 3D printing is one of those technologies that are universal. They touch almost everything. And one of the messages I'd like to convey to you is that it's going to affect every discipline. It's going to touch every industry. And it's an optimistic message. It's a happy message, unlike some of the things we've heard yesterday. And I hope it's going to change things for the better. So this is it's really about a new kind of economy that is based on the idea that people can come up with concepts, and using a machine on their desktop, press a button and make that idea into a physical reality. And it is indeed something that we've been thinking about for a long time. There's a lot of science fiction stories and themes that have to do with this idea of a machine that can make anything. Invariably, most science fiction stories end up with humanity blowing themselves up using a machine like that. But nonetheless, we want to pursue this and try to make something useful with it. So how can we make something like that in reality? So just to get us all on the same page, what is a 3D printer? So we're all familiar with a regular inkjet printer that spits out droplets of ink on a piece of paper and makes a picture. So 3D printer is essentially the same idea, but instead of droplets of ink, it spits out droplets of plastic, layer by layer, makes a three-dimensional object, a real physical three-dimensional object. Not a picture of a cup of coffee, but a coffee cup for real, and something that you can hold in your hand and actually drink coffee out of. So it's a real physical thing. And while you're at it, you might as well make some crazy shapes. You don't have to stick to a conventional cup. This is a real thing that somebody has made. I don't know if it's useful, but it's certainly something that you can try to drink out of. But the real idea is that you can go from a concept to a physical object very quickly. This is just researching for this talk. I found this sketch, and here's the three-dimensional coffee cup made out of it. So this is a single cup, but it's all made there. So you can imagine that if somebody wakes up in the middle of the night with this crazy idea, they can actually make it within a few hours. They can have their idea physically instantiated. In fact, there's this kind of competitions now on coffee cups. These are all real physical coffee cups that people are designing all over the world and printing. And the sky is the limit. So what does a machine look like? There are a couple dozen different 3D printers out there right now, a huge price range. But this is typically what it looks like. It's more or less like a microwave oven, and it literally prints the three-dimensional object that you have. Now, also, most of these objects start off as a kind of a file, a blueprint, an electronic blueprint in the computer, and that is translated into a physical object. Here you see the CAD file and the printed object. This is a kind of art piece printed in bronze. So why now? So 3D printing has been around for, I'd say, 3 decades or so, starting in the late 80s, but it has gradually progressed and caught on in the last couple of years. Here's this is the number of Google searches. You can see they pick up around 2007, and this is more or less a transition that's equivalent to about the 1975 in computers, when computers switched from mainframes to desktops. And this is about what's happening now. These 3D printers used to be very big and expensive, a kind of mainframe level, required a lot of skilled technicians to operate. They were slow and so forth. And now they're transitioning to the desktop scale, to home markets and so forth. And we're going to see how this progresses. So it's really going to change everything. So what can printers do right now? They can work with almost any material. These are just plastic parts printed with 10 micron precision, so they're very, very smooth, very precise. You can see you can make a huge range of things. You can also print in metal. These are titanium shoes, and you can see the heel here is printed. It's really something you couldn't make any other way. There's just no other way to make this. And again, this is somebody's idea. They instantiated. You can print in clay. You can even print in wood. This is kind of processed wood. It's 3D printed. You can print in glass. There's really no material almost you can't print with. You can print large scale, such as this kind of cement bench. And even larger, this is kind of plaster and the architectural scale 3D printers. And you can print small, and this is all on the scale of 1 millimeter with details at the micron scale. So all scales, all materials, it's really a fascinating technology. We've been using it in the lab to print robots quite a bit, so we've become addicted to this thing. We need let's say we need a tube for our robot. We won't walk down the hall to the stock room. We'll just sketch out a tube and hit the print button. And here you can see this is a time-lapse photo of printing a robot, and here's the robot printed. So we really, it's really unleashed an incredible amount of creativity in terms of designing all kinds of shapes of robots that are all entirely printed, including these kind of crazy shapes that would be a nightmare to fabricate using conventional technology, including this 3-gram flapping, hovering machine who's 90% printed, including the wings and so forth. So what's really interesting about this technology is its ability also, more recently, to combine multiple materials into the same print. So it's not just about making something out of titanium or ceramic or this plastic or that plastic. You can actually combine things. And this toy here was printed in a single shot, pre-assembled, with multiple materials, hard and soft, all at the same time. Again, going from a sketch into a 3D object in reality. So you can see how this is going to affect everything. And in the lab, we've been trying to take this a step forward and move away from just printing parts, passive parts, to printing active systems. So we wanted to try to print not just a robot parts, but actually print the complete machine. Maybe have a robot walk out of the printer, batteries included. So to do that, we started off printing batteries. Here you can see some batteries. Their performance is about half of commercial batteries. But what's interesting about them is that you can print them in arbitrary shape. You're not limited to the 4 standard size of batteries. You can make them in arbitrary shape and conform them to anything you need. Here's a printed actuator, a muscle, a motor that we can that bends, and we can put this together to make this robot. We haven't quite made the robot walk out of the printer yet, but this is one of our first attempts. This is actually a fish that's supposed to swim out of the printer. It's a bit easier to do that than to walk, and there it is in the water. It's not quite moving. It doesn't work yet. But one of the challenges is to try to get all these different materials to print together at the same time so that they're all mutually compatible. Now, there's really no field, no discipline, no industry that isn't going to be affected on this. And even on campus, we've seen, this is from the Near East studies, we're doing some work on printing uniforms. They scan them in the field and we can print them, and they look, feel, weigh, their color is almost identical to the original. And it's really fascinating to see that even affected there. Even in education, you can have these printers and you can engage kids in manufacturing and design in a way that no theory, no math book can engage them. I was showing this printer at my son's second grade school class, and we were printing space shuttles out of Play-Doh. And it was fascinating to see how immediately some of the kids lit up. And one kid said, can we print it in a different size? Can we change the shape of the wing and print it again? Another kid was calculating how much he could sell each shuttle and how many he could make from one block of Play-Doh and what the profit is going to be. It doesn't matter what the orientation of the child is, they're immediately calculating math, and you get them engaged in ways that you can't do in any other way. It's really fascinating to see that. So let me give you just one example of one area and how many different ways this technology can integrate and affect. So let's take a look at medical applications. So if any of you are wearing hearing aids, it's likely that the hearing aid itself, the casing, if it's a custom shape, it was 3D printed. This is one of the big applications. It would be the ear canal is scanned, and then the casing is 3D printed. It's no more one size fits all. It's custom. It's made on the spot. Here's another example of what we call surgical planning. This is something we do almost routinely at Cornell in the vet school. Let's say a dog comes in, needs surgery. They would send us the CT scan. We print the bones out of plastic, and the surgeons have time to practice the surgery before they go in. It's like putting a puzzle the second time. It's a lot faster, it's more accurate. They can cut down the surgery by half. Plus, they can prepare the plates and all that in advance. So you can imagine how something like that can actually save lives and make things better. There's also the issue of surgical training. So if you ever thought about it, how do surgeons train, and what do they train on? And it turns out that often some of the more complicated things like, say, tumor removal, there's just no way to train it. They have to do it the first time on a real patient. It's unlikely that they'll be able to train on some thing. But with 3D printing, you can pre-print some of these things for surgeons to train with actual biological materials, but materials that can simulate the actual biophysical materials. You can print implants. This is a growing area, printing real implants. This is a titanium jaw implant. The patient is scanned and it's printed, ready to be implanted with the right shape and size for that person. And even something that we've done more recently in the lab is printing with real biological materials. So now we're not talking about printing an implant out of metal and then implanting it, but actually taking a patient's cells and using those to print. So what we've done here, this is a meniscus cartilage of the knee. We CT scanned a sheep, and then we took cells from the meniscus, cultured them, and then reprinted the new meniscus. And this is meniscus, and here's the CT scan. And we incubated this for 3 months. It becomes similar to the original. And then you can implant that back in. So we're not talking about a plastic replacement part that has wear and tear. It's not a transplant that has rejection issues. This is literally an original part. Donate your cells, recultured and reprinted. So you can really imagine that at some point you have your whole body CT scanned MRI'd, and the whole thing is on file. If you need a spare part, you call up, and you order your parts. That's the way it's going to be. Also printing medical custom medicine. This was published just recently. People printing medical pills on demand as they are needed. And in the far future, really thinking about this idea of printing inside the body. Not just printing outside and implanting, but printing in situ where and when it is needed. And we've already been able to print inside a bone, scan it, and print the missing part, missing piece as it is needed. So I often talk about this and people ask, okay, so this is all cool, but what's the killer app? What's the big thing that everybody's going to use this in the future? And frankly, if I knew, I wouldn't be here, I'd be working on it. But let me just give you a couple of ideas of things that could be. And people argue about this. One could be fashion. And it's interesting to see how many people are exploring this to make fashion all the way from clothing. There are a couple of things that I couldn't show here but are also being used. There's shoes, jewelry. There's a website, Shapeways, that has tens of thousands of items of jewelry ready to be 3D printed on demand when somebody orders them. Incredible shapes. Maybe it's going to be toys. There's a lot of interest in toys. People are doing printing toys of shapes and all shapes and sizes and applications. But it's really difficult to predict what a killer app is going to be. And so to try to do that, we said, okay, let's make a 3D printer, an open source one, and let's see what people use it. Let's bring all those 3D printers down from the $250,000 to something that people can afford and build at home, and let's see what people actually use those 3D printers for. And it was really interesting to see the application. It wasn't printing robots. It wasn't printing cuneiforms. It was something else. It was printing food. And that's what we found, that's what people want to do. Is really interesting. Give you a few examples here. One of the first applications back, that was in 2006, was printing chocolate. Chocolate is the ultimate material for 3D printing. It's also good for business. It's a consumable, literally. People print this and they immediately need to print more. There's lots of applications. We connected with Dave Arnold's a chef at the French Culinary Institute in New York City, who used this to print all kinds of interesting things. Here's, I think, printing celery and scallops in the shape of a building, and then frying it. And so, if you've ever eaten something like this, when it has the shape of a building, it tastes very differently. Here's, if you don't like that, you can print in the shape of a gear wheel or something else. And it's interesting just the kind of the space of suddenly things that you can do. Here's a really interesting example. This is a cookie, and it's precise. It's a block. But what's interesting about this cookie is that if you cut it in half, there's text inside. You can imagine, we're already printing these, for on demand for various events in the university. But you can see here how you can take this idea of printing and food and combine it and make interesting things. So a lot of people think it's a bad idea to mix food, and this is the mother of processed foods. But on the other hand, it opens the door to combining programming in computers and food in a way that's never done before, something we call digital cooking. The idea that you can download a recipe, load in the cartridges, and print your food, maybe share recipes, print half the cookie here and the other half on the other side of the planet. So a lot of interesting things. So I want to conclude with the broader implications of where this is going. So these are just examples, and every discipline is affected by this, and really every industry is going to be affected. There's a lot of also kind of grave implications to things we do today. One of them is copyright and intellectual property. People are copying things, making things. It's going to be very interesting. It's going to make It's going to make music copying look like a piece of cake compared to what's going to happen when people copy physical objects like that. But there's also a question of liability. What happens when people make things they shouldn't be making? Who's going to control this and so forth? People have made guns and they work, and it's interesting. Although I have to say, at least in the U.S., there are easier ways to get guns, but it's still a possibility to do that. This is actually a 3D printed one, and it works. If you print, let's say, a steering wheel, and you use it and it breaks, who's to blame? Is it the designer? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the material supplier? All these things we're used to thinking about who's making and who's responsible are changed. There's also the question of energy, and this is a topic that we've discussed yesterday quite a bit. Is this a technology? Is this a green technology, or is it not? And when we started thinking about this, it was kind of obvious that it's a good thing. It's a net-shaped technology. You only print what you need when you need it. You only use the materials that you need. But turns out that it's actually a technology that uses a lot of energy. In fact, it uses about 10 times more energy per kilogram of part than conventional manufacturing. However, so that part isn't so good. There's also the tendency, like we heard yesterday, to print more than we need. So I came into the lab one day and I saw on the table 24 printouts of an object. You see them here. And it was a student that was just trying to print something. It didn't work. He changed the diameter a bit, printed it again, didn't work, changed it again, printed. And so we get in this habit of, it's easy to make things. We can make lots of them. But the real saving is in the supply chain, in trimming down the supply chain, in cutting down these pieces and combining them, and also the distribution network on the other side. And if you ask Walmart, they'll tell you that 80% of their carbon footprint is in the transportation of the supply chain. That's where the big impact is. And if these 3D printers can help reduce both the supply chain as well as the distribution networks by having people print it at home or close to where they need it, that's a huge saving, and that's probably going to be a big effect. And the second one is the ability to make optimized parts, and this is Airbus 3D printing brackets. And they're just as strong as the original parts, but they use less material, and therefore the airplanes are lighter, and that's a huge saving over the lifetime of the product. So it's going to have a profound effect on the environment through this kind of area. So if there's one message I'd like to leave you with, is that this technology is changing things because for the first time in human history, complexity is free. It means that making something complicated is no more difficult, time-consuming, expensive, or requires more skills than making something simple. Printing a block doesn't require less skill or resources than printing something that has more features in it. So this is a profound departure from all of human history. We're making more complicated things required more resources and skill, and that departure has created a situation where there are new kinds of designs and new kinds of designers that are popping up, and that's going to change everything. Thank you.
About the meniscus, I'll have one of those. In fact, I could use two.
We only saw them in pairs.
I was a squash player in my day, blew out both knees. How much would a meniscus cost?
Well, it takes 20 minutes to print.
20 minutes.
Yes, but we still need the surgeon to implant it. That's where the cost is.
And is there a little acceptance or a little resistance in medical ranks to this idea?
I think there's a lot of acceptance. The challenge is, of course, to go through all the FDA approvals and so the clinical trials. But I think it's a better approach than some of the conventional.
Well, I'll sign up for one of those trials. I was always surprised by how intractable this problem is. It seemed like a relatively simple thing, right? It's a kind of shock absorber that sits between two big bones. So I thought, how hard can that be, right? A gel. I mean, they're doing it with breasts, stick something in there, or inject a liquid, but there was really nothing much. So I'm kind of walking bone on bone and hoping for the best. We live in an age of miracles, really. And the last thing I want to say is you seem so, not offhand, but calm about this. If I were involved, I'd be jumping up and down. I mean, really, quite amazing research, Hod. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.